Hello and welcome to this week's episode of GIANT's Healthy Innovators TV. My name is Barry Shrier and I'm your host. I'm the founder of GIANT Health, which is a global community of nearly 300,000 people. Our strapline is that we serve everybody whose business is healthcare, technology, and innovation. And what we do every week is we bring you the leading innovators, the most interesting and dynamic and advanced people working in the areas of technology and innovation that relate to healthcare. What we're doing is we're trying to improve the health and the well-being of people around the world by facilitating and accelerating the adoption of new technology to deliver better healthcare outcomes at lower cost. So this week, I'm very, very pleased to introduce you to my good friend, Andy Ramgobin from Technomove. Andy, hi, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Barry, and thank you very much for inviting me onto this TV episode.
No, it's a pleasure. Really looking forward to our conversation. Before we begin, I just want to encourage all of our viewers from around the world to like this episode and to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That helps us to help you. And I'm also very keen to Before we begin, I'd just like to encourage all of our visitors from around the world to like this episode and to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That helps us to help you. And we'd also like to thank some of our sponsors. Thank you very much to McKinsey, our knowledge partner. Thank you to Barclays Bank International. Thanks to Vodafone. And also in particular, thanks to Andy and Technomove. We've loved working with you guys and really pleased to be developing our collaboration with you. So Andy, thanks very much for that.
Oh, you're very welcome, Barry.
So today we're talking about a very interesting subject, and I'm keen to learn more about it. Sometimes people say, well, what does that have to do with healthcare? But we will get on to that. So to begin with, Andy, you've been telling us about the importance of this theme of immersion cooling, and in particular, fluoride immersion cooling. But if we could take a step back and just talk about that more broadly, and then we can learn more about the importance of that and the applications in healthcare.
Yeah, fantastic. So if I'll just do a brief introduction on myself and Technomove.
Yes, please.
So my name's Andy Ramgobin. I am a principal technology evangelist at Technomove, and although that's quite a fancy title, it really kind of means someone that will go and speak to businesses and enterprises, extrapolate as much information about their current IT platform end to end, and then help them stitch together new investments with legacy investments using the finest thread and the most effective needle. So really trying to help businesses disrupt and innovate. And Technomove is a business that's been going for about 24 years. We're a world leader in data center migration. And we also work very heavily in boutique consultancy and end-to-end transformation technology. So if I start, Barry, with a little bit about what is immersion cooling.
Sure.
And then we can talk about it through, and hopefully it will be educational for your viewers.
And even cooling, if we can get that fundamental, in case some of our audience are deeply involved in healthcare, but not so expert in IT and some of the core issues in IT.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk about immersion cooling, and I'll also talk about how things are traditionally cooled in data centers now with kind of air cooling and air-cooled racks. So the main thing is the traditional way of cooling high-performance DC equipment is air cooling and air-cooled racks. The issue with this is that power charges are going through the roof, and due to the shift towards high-performance computing, AI, machine learning, and deep learning, especially in healthcare and life sciences, the power output needed to run things like parallel computing and crunch the data is exponentially growing.
Right.
The need to derive insights from data as soon as possible is driving huge technology shift and cultural shift within enterprises. So you think if we start to demand power and efficiency in a data center, then we have to talk about the cooling systems that are going to enable a green and sustainable IT infrastructure. So immersion cooling as a method requires two different ways of cooling computers and electronics. The difference starts around the dielectric liquid that is chosen to use in immersion. So we can talk about single phase cooling and also dual phase cooling. And we need to kind of start to understand the differences between each cooling technique in order to work out which one is better for us. So if you think power, efficiency, sustainability are becoming increasing areas of concern for businesses in the data center industry, there are a number of factors that contribute to this growth and importance, such as 5G, AI, machine learning, and deep learning.
Sure.
And the growing use of these kinds of technologies has led to a dramatic rise in temperatures. Businesses are now searching for ways to effectively cool their equipment. while simultaneously reducing their effects on the environment and also increasing their compute capacity. And this is what allows businesses to innovate whilst also trying to achieve their sustainability targets. So there are two or three options available. Normally it's through air conditioning, direct to chip, or liquid cooling. But when we talk about single phase immersion cooling, this is where servers or other IT components are submerged in a hydrocarbon based dielectric liquid, which is thermally conductive, similar to mineral oil.
Okay.
The coolant never changes state. It never boils or freezes and always remains in a liquid form.
Nice.
Coolant gets pumped to a heat exchanger where heat is transferred to a cooler water circuit. And this technique uses things like open baths, as there's little or no risk of the coolant evaporating. Two-phase immersion cooling is very similar, but the heat is removed from the system by circulating the liquid into direct contact with hot components.
Okay.
Thereby, the liquid undergoes low temperature evaporation process to cool the hot components and transfer the heat out of the liquid. The gas is cooled again by something like a heat exchanger. So that'd be something like a condenser coil to allow return flow into the larger liquid volume. So both single phase and two phase cooling offer ease of location for data centers, thanks to their plug and play configuration, and the lack of dependence on traditional infrastructure. They're both techniques perform well against each other where compatibility is concerned.
Nice.
And users should experience almost no issues when deciding which hardware to use,
Right.
or if they want to retrofit their current setup. So a lot of servers are compatible with immersion cooling now. Supermicro and 2CRSI have led the way, but the bigger players like Dell, HPE, Cisco, and Lenovo are all working really hard to support immersing their server hardware. So you've got efficiency levels of methods significantly higher when comparing them to traditional air-cooled data center.
Right.
Current research suggests that two-phase cooling may have a slight edge over single-phase cooling, claiming a PUE, or power usage efficiency, of 1.02 as opposed to 1.03. The argument of single phase cooling is more to do with when you've got maintenance that needs to be done. It's far easier if you need to.
I understand. Yeah.
So you can.
So Andy, pardon me for interrupting you, but again, I want to make sure that our listeners get this and they can see the relationship between this extremely interesting and important issue and the bigger picture. So just to, like I said, start from the baseline, so to speak. Number one, obviously, data is unbelievably important in healthcare, and it's growing in importance massively. And everybody around the world is agreeing to that. Number two, as a requirement, we're drowning in data, but there's a requirement to synthesize that data, to crunch the numbers, to analyze the data in order to get meaningful information out of it for clinicians, for pharma research, and so forth. So as a consequence of these things, you have the so-called data centers, which obviously are these large buildings full of computer servers around the world, and they're growing in importance. And because everything, from example, for pharma companies and hospitals, they're using these data centers, which are the outsourced providers of computing power. The issues relating to the management of the data centers are growing and growing. And within all that, you have this massive issue of the heat and the energy which is being consumed. The energy which is being consumed, which is a challenge regarding environmental issues, and the heat as a result of the energy being consumed by all these servers in these very large data centers. So, like I said, I hope you don't mind, but there'll be an awful lot of people listening in who don't necessarily have that background understanding and the picture of how important this is. So therefore, massive growing use of data and need to compute data in healthcare worldwide, resulting in huge growth in computer power requirement, computing, which is resulting in the big growth of data centers worldwide, which is resulting in the big growth of energy consumption, but then a problem, which is the creation of all this heat. Therefore, what we have is this extremely interesting new immersion cooling technology, which is solving that heat problem in a way that's more cost effective, but it's also more environmentally sound. Is that a good summary?
I think it's a really good summary, Barry. I mean, you should probably come and work in my industry with your understanding there. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. And data, as you said, is growing exponentially. It is the need for things like parallel processing and GPUs to run machine learning algorithms and deep learning algorithms on that big data that allow businesses to derive insight. And the problem with these big computing platforms is they require a huge amount of power. And as you said, in a traditional data center, because it's air cooled, there's a lot of loss of heat. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later in the episode, and how you can start to recapture that heat and repurpose it. So it's a very different way of doing things.
Okay.
Really different way of doing things. And I've got a couple of very high level stats. They're indicative. So, all data center providers will have different pricing. But to just give you a little bit of an idea of what a traditional air-cooled rack, for example, looks like in terms of trying to achieve, 100 kilowatts of power versus your traditional rack. So if you're happy, if I can just walk you through those kind of costs, just to give you a kind of a cost scenario basis, and then we can kind of talk a little bit more about, why this kind of technology is important today for healthcare.
Absolutely. The cost comparison is actually extremely important because, of course, a fundamental requirement in healthcare is how do we deliver additional, greater healthcare services at lower cost. So at the most fundamental level, the demand for healthcare services is exploding. And the requirement to serve the relentlessly growing demand in healthcare cannot simply be served by just finding more doctors and nurses and hospital managers. That's not scalable. So technology and tech innovation holds out this promise of being able to empower healthcare providers to deliver more healthcare services at lower cost. So going back to what you just said, the issues of how do we enable the delivery of more healthcare services by using more technology, but at lower cost. That's a super, super important issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our strategies, although, our roles in business are very different, probably align quite well with what you've just said. So if I talk about, a traditional sort of hot and cold aisle racks versus single phase immersion cooling, a standard rack tends to have 16 to 32 amps.
Okay.
Got an average power used of about 6 kilowatts, which is about 26 amps.
Okay.
Airflow cooled traditional temperature set year round is around about 21.5 degrees Celsius. You've got high density compute racks and cold aisle racks with free air cooling, water-based cooling. These are ones that have kind of got in-row or rear doors. And then you've got average power used is, 6 to 25 kilowatts, about 108 amps. And then when you look at immersion baths,
right,
we're talking 50 to 100 kilowatts. So 217 amps to about 435 amps.
Oh, okay.
And that power used is 50 kilowatts is equivalent to around about 6 hours of energy usage.
Right.
So immersion fluid properties, we're talking 12,000 times more efficient in removing heat in a dielectric liquid compared to traditional air cooling.
That is huge.
Huge. So we're talking
Phenomenal.
about potentially, 40% cut on carbon compared to standard colo. And if the heat recapture is deployed, then we're talking potentially 90%. So this is where I talked about some high level costs.
Yep.
Standard rack, 3.5 kilowatts approx per rack. To get to 100 kilowatts, we're going to need about 29 racks. And in a traditional data center, this could cost around £59,000 per month, which is obviously a huge amount of money. If we look at high density racks using 20 kilowatts approx,
right,
to get to 100 kilowatts, we're talking about 5 racks.
Yeah.
That's going to cost circa £54,000 per month.
Yes. Yeah.
But if we're looking at 2 immersion baths to get to 100 kilowatts, we're talking potentially 41k per month.
So that's an extraordinary difference, isn't it?
Yeah, massive saving, Barry. And I think that's really important. We've talked a lot about, the benefits from a technology perspective.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, a lot of businesses, a lot of enterprises with their corporate social responsibility are having to now meet sustainability targets. So
Oh, 100%. And that's a very, very big issue in healthcare. Absolutely huge.
Yeah, exactly. I think the issues probably more than I do. Although I work very closely with healthcare. Giant, that's your business. So I think you guys are very close with feet on the ground in terms of what's needed from these new innovative, disruptive platforms. And it's not just facilitating technology; it's also about driving costs down and driving carbon emissions down.
And everybody wants to hear that. What are Andy? What are some examples of what you call it workload types that this technology is appropriate for?
So I'm actually this is a perfect time to kind of breach into the next kind of portion. So I would say high performance computing, AI, machine learning, and deep learning.
Right.
These are all kind of workload types that require high intense compute platforms.
Okay.
They require big unstructured storage, very fast networking switches, and usually you can buy these now in kind of AI pods, where it's kind of pod-based infrastructure where everything is kind of configured and engineered, and then it slots right directly into a rack. So
yes.
And these, when we talk about these types of use cases, and I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail later, but why are these important to healthcare? So if I only had a couple of sentences, high performance computing platform is needed really for the innovation in healthcare. Due to the cost of hardware now, businesses are needing to find savings on power and cooling.
Yes.
Now imagine you can have all of those savings, but create even more from reusing the heat from the tank to potentially heat a hospital. For me, that's kind of game-changing technology. So not only do you get all of the benefits of the type of workload and the type of analytics you're trying to deploy and use, there is a potential with these immersion baths, certainly from Submer, where you can recapture that heat, ensure there's no heat loss. And imagine where you could actually start to create a new saving stream by actually reheating a hospital from one of these units that's placed locally. And when you talk about healthcare and life sciences, they're going to require high, agile, performant computing to run a vast array of AI-powered applications. And these are to manage people's conditions, detect early warning signals, so things like anomaly detection. These applications may need to be running locally, hosted in data centers. So that could be a hospital, for example.
Yes.
Due to the cost, network demands, latency of running these applications into the cloud. And I think this is where Submer really shine, because they've got an edge computing appliance that is built specifically for remote office and branch office sites, which I think is really interesting. And you've got edge computing, and 5G is something that I spoke about at GIANT December event, and I wrote a lot on the website, Technomove's website, about Cisco Hyperflex.
Yep.
Be used as edge compute platform with NVIDIA GPUs and for real-time inferencing. And we've always had some issues with edge computing, and this has largely been down to how does a business keep powerful infrastructure at these small locations?
Mm-hmm.
How do we connect these locations to more powerful data centers or public cloud instances? So real-time inferencing was a term coined by NVIDIA, and it was born from the delay of latency involved in transferring the data collected at the edge to central processing platforms to be analyzed. By the time the data had been shifted across the wide area network, it's no longer real time. There's also security concerns if that data is not encrypted in transit. And there are a number of different ways that can be used to combat these limitations in traditional technology these days. SD-WAN allows a business to securely move data across the wide area network, while prioritizing data traffic and ensuring the data traverses the most effective and quickest route. A big technology vendor called F5 have taken a very different approach to content delivery networks, which was traditionally used to present content to the user using the closest point of presence, or edge, to ensure latency was reduced. Their distributed cloud services essentially leverages a global backbone network, uses an SD-WAN underlay, and then you've got things like Kubernetes instances that are used at the edge computing infrastructure, which cache application content next to the user. So if there's an internet outage, the branch and application still survives. So, traditional kind of co-location facilities are, always going to still exist. Whilst edge computing has a lot of benefits, there's a lot of limitations that can be done at the edge. And when you look at enterprise and hospitals, they're still going to need traditional data centers.
Exactly.
Instead of having air-cooled vertical racks, they may now have submerged racks. We talked about data being critical to delivering higher quality integrated care.
Exactly.
Earlier, and I think if we look at
Huge.
the healthcare industry in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be an AI-powered platform with preemptive and predictive approach. There'll be a laser-like focus on better patient outcomes,
Yes.
as well as reducing the load on employees, which you mentioned. You can't just go out and find more doctors. So, much of the analysis for machine learning and deep learning models, it's going to be really important here. We spoke last year at December's event about Cambridge One. That's a supercomputer hosted in Essex, which is dedicated to healthcare and life sciences.
Nice.
Got some notable collaborators: GSK, AstraZeneca, King's College London. I was very fortunate to be in Silicon Valley in 2019 for NVIDIA's AI conference. And there was a lot of talk then, Barry, 3 years ago, about how computer vision could be used to scan hundreds and thousands, millions even, chest x-rays and breast
cancer. Yeah, and that's getting developed very, very rapidly. So the whole, what do you want to call it, data processing realm that relates to traditional pattern recognition behavior, whether it's a GP trying to diagnose a symptom or whether it's a radiologist looking at a scan or that type of thing. Huge, exciting opportunities. There's also a democratization issue there, whereby obviously at much lower cost now, using machine learning and AI, for example, scan data from a lower income part of the world can be automatically viewed and symptoms assessed and diagnoses made. So it's very, very exciting and just so important for healthcare. I just want to say that a lot of our listeners probably aren't so technical, Andy. So if we can keep it at the most broad level, I think that would be most valuable. Are there some vendors in particular relating to this whole theme that you'd like to showcase or that it would be important for us to help our listeners learn about?
Yeah, so Submer, which is one of those vendors, which, well, for me, are the kind of leader in immersion cooling.
Nice.
And Carbon Z are going to be obviously one of the co-location providers that I really wanted to talk about. So,
excellent.
Just going back, Barry, and I'll try and keep it as a very baseline. And if I go too technical, by all means, strip it back. But you seem to be very good at being able to summarize what I'm saying in a way that your viewers can really understand. But just to kind of finish off on the high performance compute piece, because this is kind of really important that, if you've got, in terms of diagnostics, if there are cases where analysis needs to be performed just before surgery, you've got cancer operations, chemotherapy or radiotherapy, to ensure that treatment is as well targeted as possible. You're talking about using these machine learning and deep learning algorithms to deliver surgical precision that's delivered by machines, not just surgeons. And I think that's a really interesting point of topic. And one of the most respected research committees in the UK has done a lot of work in Huntington's disease and things like Alzheimer's and dementia. These are diseases of old age, and in studies, they've been able to use machine learning to be able to identify the early symptoms of Huntington's disease in 40% of the time that it takes today with all the best available approaches.
Exactly. So such a big change.
It's huge. And Huntington's isn't something that you can necessarily cure, but it is something that you can delay and treat. And if we can develop techniques to expedite the detection, then we have a real opportunity to be able to treat them long term, or so long before they become really debilitating. And when we talk about AI, and you've mentioned it already, require huge amounts of compute, require huge amounts of bandwidth. You've got hospitals and other care facilities that may need to keep that processing power local on site instead of at a data center. So they can have all of it at the edge. And when we talk about edge in the healthcare world, if we talk about NHS, that edge would be the hospital, potentially, not necessarily a data center. So you may start to see that kind of hybrid. Well, we might keep some of our infrastructure and computing platforms in our traditional co-location facility, but actually we might want to now bring some of these immersion baths that are built for small sites on site so that we can have that processing power right where we need it, so that we don't have to worry about data going over to a data center or then going over to a cloud platform to be analyzed. And I think that's That's really, really important.
Yes.
Just before I get on to Submer, Barry, there's one kind of really important bit that I do want to speak about, which is a little bit around high performance compute for life sciences and what's going in on that area. So universities and biotechnology companies are embracing this predictive analytics as we've talked about in fighting cancer, personalizing medicine, regenerating organs. And that technology has been paying huge dividends. For example, research institutions that have been using Illumina's DNA sequence technology for genotyping and epigenetic applications, they're leveraging high-performance computing and parallel processing for GPUs to get better and faster results. Modern healthcare professionals have got more data, as you mentioned, Barry, at their fingertips than ever before. Right. So being able to give hospitals and healthcare professionals more memory, more compute, more power, effectively,
absolutely,
in near real time, then we can transform patient outcomes. Hospitals can use edge devices like wearables and bedside devices to capture, huge amounts of patient data. And then these computing platforms, these high performance compute platforms that we talked about, can then use that processing data in real time to drive insights that can be acted on immediately by medical staff to transform patient outcomes.
Nice.
Drug researchers typically begin their process by identifying drug targets, such as proteins through genomics, and using these HPC and cryo-electron microscopy, they can build a 3D model of the protein and use it to test a small molecule drug candidates. And this modeling is becoming much more efficient than your traditional methods, which ultimately gets life-changing drugs into clinical trials quicker.
Exactly. The difference is huge. Absolutely magnificent. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Andy. Really, really interesting insights.
And just, again, this is probably your area. You understand a lot more genomics than I do. But, by doing a lot of research, I've seen that it's possible now for governments and research bodies to run these huge sequencing programs and national studies that are really having an effect on the genome, on health outcomes. NVIDIA have kind of been at the forefront of life sciences for a number of years now.
Absolutely.
If we look at these phenotypic screening and histology, deep learning is playing a really key role in enabling these high throughput systems using histology slides to extract useful information from microscopy images. As a result, these scientists are able to associate the fluorescent information from the images with the gene function, gene expression profiles and protein profiles. And this is just allowing things to move at a much, much quicker rate. So
absolutely. No, this is fundamental, Andy. This is just so impactful. I think our listeners have a good general understanding of this. And again, our community is more about healthcare tech. And so if it's okay, we won't go down too much into, for example, genomics and other, if you will, early life science stage aspects of the application. But like I said before, really keen to hear a little bit about some of the vendors that are involved in this space.
Yeah, so look, we talked about Submer very briefly. There are lots of different immersion cooling technologies out there, but for me, I would say that Submer are kind of the lead. They're certainly the ones that have been the most disruptive.
What do they do?
So they provide these baths, Barry. So they create these immersion baths, and they have their own proprietary dielectric liquid.
Right.
So hopefully, when we'll show a couple of videos at the end, you'll start to see these baths that have got computers, network and servers submersed in the liquid.
Nice.
So they actually build the baths.
Yeah.
Traditionally, we talk about a power distribution unit, a PDU, in traditional infrastructure.
Yeah.
But in this new wave of technology, it's all about the CDU, the cooling distribution unit.
Okay.
So, Submer is an idea that was born in 2015 from two brilliant and original minds, Daniel Pope and Pope Vowles, to make operating and construction data centers more sustainable. They enable this generation of cooling and automation for the data center and energy intense environments.
Brilliant.
Integrating their pristine, highly efficient and sustainable technologies. So they're kind of solving challenges to powering the use cases of the future. And in their own words, they say Submer helps enable data centers that make sense through products, platforms, APIs, processes and installations that will move, the big hyperscalers, co-locations, and huge industries to new levels of efficiency and innovation. And so I really suggest, and we've got a little bit of video that will come up later. It's really cool. Excuse the pun, because obviously the whole point of this is about a new wave of cooling. And then if I talk a little bit about Carbon Z, they're a co-location provider based in Swindon with their own data center.
Nice.
Their focus is to be one of the carbon neutral, carbon zero data centers in the UK using this Submer technology and renewable power. So what they're looking at doing is specializing in offering their clients these types of technologies. We talked about high performance computing, high volume data storage, and using and identifying new sustainable technologies and solutions being developed and coming to the market. I'd say at their core, they're principally a data center co-location provider, but they've grown their offering to provide their clients options of using green technology and new sustainable solutions. So their focus, from the name Carbon Z, is to become carbon zero and carbon negative as fast as possible.
Perfect.
All of their power has been sourced from 100% carbon neutral, using renewable energy providers to achieve this. They also work with and support wind farms in power generation. They're looking at the market for self-generation using solar as they build and develop their current and future sites to pass cost savings to their clients.
Excellent.
And one of their big objectives, like we said, Barry, is to take that reuse and that heat loss and be able to use that heat generated to then provide this to others as an alternative heat source.
Yeah, you mentioned that before. And that's such a very, very interesting and relevant application. Absolutely fabulous. So are there any examples of building these data centers in hospitals, or is that, if you will, a proposition that they're ambitious to promote?
Yeah, I think it's all of this is very new, Barry. So the technology, so I saw Submer 3 years ago at Goonhilly Earth Station in Cornwall. That's a satellite landing station. And it was used for AI. But normally, and you've heard me talk about this before, it takes 5 to 7 years for technology to be adopted.
Of course.
And that's usually because cost starts at very expensive. And education starts at the other end. There isn't a huge amount of education, and sometimes vendors can be a bit guilty of coming out with the technology and expecting people to just buy it. But in actual fact, there has to be a huge amount of education here to try and craft the use case with these businesses. So I know Submer, I know Carbon Z, and Technimove. We're all in the basis of having these early conversations with NHS trusts.
Excellent.
About how can we shift the way you traditionally do things with your traditional data center to more of a hybrid approach, and where can we provide proof of concept units whereby Submer will effectively put a unit on site at a hospital, or for the NHS trusts that are in the surrounding area of Swindon and Oxford, which is where Carbon Z are, how can they actually look at putting these high performance compute platforms and workloads, instead of going to buying all of the kit and putting it in a data center and paying for that from a CapEx perspective for the hardware, and then on an OpEx perspective for the cooling, the space, the management in a data center. Can we actually use the investment that Carbon Z have already made in this new technology and high performance compute platforms, and actually be able to have a platform that's ready to use, that can be supported in terms of location by Carbon Z, and then the IT team would still manage that, if that makes sense. So
exactly. So that's a new hybrid structure, isn't it? Which I think is very, very elegant. Yeah. Did you say, Andy, that you have some demo videos you can share with us?
Yeah, so I think we've got a really nice short video of Submer, which, again, excuse the pun, it's super cool, about the baths with some high performance kit in. And then we've got a data center tour from Carbon Z, just showing a little bit about the data center and showing the baths as well.
Excellent. No, that's
that will give your users
good. I think our listeners would really, really love to see that type of thing. So, Andy, these demonstrations are so extremely interesting. And I think all of our listeners, quite literally from around the world, are going to want to learn a lot more. This is new technology. We don't see this embedded in every hospital worldwide, but the opportunities are just so crucial for healthcare, enabling more computing power, lower costs, more environmentally, if you will, friendly services, to grow what we know is just a non-controversial fact, the fact that there is a bigger demand for managing data, for crunching numbers, for interpreting,
Yeah.
growing applications in machine learning and AI. So regarding, for example, these two vendors that you mentioned, Andy, and you're working with them and liaising with them, we have Submer and Carbon Z. For technology leaders and technology equipment decision makers and procurement professionals in healthcare, we would invite them to come to you, wouldn't we? And then there'd be, if you will, opportunities for you to provide training, knowledge, introductions, and connecting with those vendors. So how would that work if we invite people to contact you, and then what would happen?
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, anyone can contact Carbon Z or Submer directly. But I think because Technimove are kind of the solution specialists and the technologists in this trio or trifecta of companies, if they contact Technimove in the first instance, then we can
Nice.
do the educational overview piece of where a business is at today, where they're trying to move to. Because sometimes some businesses will want to look at something like this, but they won't necessarily have either the budget or the use case. Just because learning and deep learning is doing a lot for lots of different industries, including healthcare, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's for everyone. So I think we'll act as the kind of value add overview that will really help take a customer on that journey.
Yes.
And if a customer really does have a use case and an interest, then we can introduce them directly to Submer, where they can look at getting a proof of concept unit. So usually on like a 30-day trial, for example, they can purchase obviously the hardware that they're going to immerse in the baths from ourselves.
Right.
Or if they're in the Swindon, Oxford local area and they want to be part of Carbon Z's, super cool carbon zero, carbon negative approach, and then we can just put them in touch with Carbon Z, who have already invested in Submer baths,
Okay.
and are actually now investing in some of the technology that is immersed. Then it could just be a service that is effectively customer, takes the hardware in the immersion bath, the data center space from Carbon Z, and then their IT team manage that infrastructure.
Absolutely. Excellent. Hey, well, let's summarize, Andy. This has been so interesting. And although I think a lot of our listeners might say, well, I never thought about any issues relating to computer processing power and the generation of heat and the consumption of energy, we know that these are very, very big issues, and they're actually quite fundamental for the future of healthcare. So, Andy, how do people get a hold of you personally?
I think if they can just come through the Technimove website, there's a contact us piece. If they just reference that they've watched this video, that'll either find its way to myself or one of the team. That would be the easiest and quickest.
No, that's perfect. We'll also put links, obviously, to the website at the bottom of our video here. So, Andy, this has been so interesting and so informative. And we're also very grateful for you putting so much time into helping our audience learn about these subjects. Very important, and we're quite keen to develop this discussion. So perhaps we could invite you to come back on the show maybe 3 or 4 months from now with an update, with a little bit more detail, any future case studies that are bubbling up and that type of thing. So, Andy, on behalf of everybody at GIANT Health, obviously, and of course, everybody around the world who are our listeners in the healthcare innovation community, we'd like to thank you.
You're very welcome, Barry. Thank you for inviting me onto the show.
Good stuff. So once again, this has been Andy Ramgobin from Technimove talking about the extremely important issues of immersion cooling and the issues of the growing requirements for data and data management and computing power in healthcare, which are exploding worldwide, and the associated challenges of energy consumption and heat output, and what the most advanced new technology solutions are to this. So thank you once again, Andy. This has been this week's episode of GIANT's Healthy Innovators TV. We'd like to thank our sponsors, McKinsey, our knowledge partner, and Vodafone Business, one of our leading global sponsors. We'd like to thank Barclays Bank. Once again, thanks to Andy and Technomove for your sponsorship and support. We really appreciate that. And we'd also like to invite everybody to go to the GIANT website. As you know, we run what the Financial Times newspaper refers to as Europe's largest, most valuable annual healthcare technology event. That's the GIANT Health event, taking place on the 6th and 7th of December in London. So please visit our website, www.giant.health, where you can learn more about the event. You can get tickets and learn more about our speakers and sponsors and exhibitors. Andy, we're looking forward to you speaking actually at the event this year. So we're grateful for your support. Lastly, if we can invite all of our listeners to like this video and to subscribe, that would allow us to help you further. So please do so. Once again, I'm Barry Shrier. Thank you for listening.